I interviewed him along with his wife just this past November. Yeah, and that was an incredibly interesting conversation. And both are deeply committed to their country and to saving their country from this assault. And they're young, and they're Russian speaking, and they grew up in the Russian part of Ukraine. Putin decided that he didn't want to see any democracy on his border. He wanted to create an imperialist version of the previous Soviet empire. The Soviet Union collapsed because of a Russian president who decided that people's freedom mattered more than keeping this artificial political tyrannical construct over, hundreds of millions of people in the former Soviet Union.
Hello, my name is Mikhail Zygar, and today my guest is Christiane Amanpour, one of the best known journalists in the world and the leading interviewer on CNN. Did you think that you and your family were living in Iran forever? Was it considered to be like the life-changing and turning point of your life?
Yeah, it was. I don't know whether we knew we'd be leaving forever. I certainly remember my father sometime in the summer before, when the revolution was underway, saying that things will never be the same again. But I don't think he or we were sure what exactly that meant. I left in order to go to university. My parents stayed with my two younger sisters, and they were going to stay because they had no options, nowhere else to go. But then they used to travel every summer to Europe, and the summer of 1980, they came out for their annual summer holiday. And then Iraq invaded Iran in the September of 1980. And that caused a whole load of domino effects, including closing borders and this and that. And my parents didn't go back in the September to take my sisters back to school. And they waited and waited, but that war lasted for 8 years. So they did not go back. And in fact, none of us went back to Iran until I did. I was the first one to go, but as a journalist, when I was covering the first Gulf War. So that was in 1991.
I'm asking because I'm hearing a lot of parallels between Russian diaspora and Russian civil society that had to flee, that left Russia last year, and now that huge Iranian diaspora that lives out of country for 40 years has something to share and something to teach and to tell to the newly immigrants from Russia. And actually most of Russians think that they are going to be back very soon, and some of them think that maybe like Iranians, they have to spend the rest of their lives outside of the country. Do you think that those parallels are relevant?
Yes, I do think those parallels are relevant. The two situations are slightly different, obviously, but one is an internal upheaval and the other one is caused by Russia invading another country and causing a self-inflicted crisis. And I think that in any event, it destabilizes populations and people leave for all sorts of reasons: safety, opportunity, disregard for the and dislike of what's left at home, the internal system and the politics of what is left at home. And I think you can see also across your border in Ukraine, millions of people have had to flee because their home has come under bombardment by Russia. So there are many different reasons why diasporas grow and form. I think one of the great things is that so many people who leave are often people who are young and eager to start a new life and to put their considerable skills and talent and energy into whatever they decide to do, but it's not in their own country. So much of a country's human potential and human resources are lost when a country creates a dynamic that causes people to flee that country.
Now you are probably one of the international journalists who knows the situation in the Ukraine better than the majority, and you definitely know President Zelensky much better than most of global journalists, because you've interviewed him twice, 3 times.
I've now interviewed him 3 times in total. And then, of course, I asked him a question during his press conference. But I interviewed him before the war, so the year before the war at the Munich Security Conference. And this was when he was embroiled in the essentially Ukraine-US controversy over Donald Trump. And I interviewed him while Trump was being impeached for that now terrible phone call with President Zelensky about weapons and about internal political dynamics in the US. Then I interviewed him same time last year, and that was a few days before the invasion. And then I interviewed him along with his wife just this past November. Yeah, and that was an incredibly interesting conversation. And both are deeply committed to their country and to saving their country from this assault. And they're young, and they're Russian speaking, and they grew up in the Russian part, Russian speaking part of Ukraine. Yeah,
definitely. Do you expect?
And they're Jewish, so. The whole stupid narrative about denazification and so it's just ridiculous.
Yeah. You know your audience. You more or less understand who are watching you. Do you expect the American audience, the Western audience, to be so passionate and so in love with President Zelensky as it seemed to be for a long period of time? Because the traditional narrative of Russian propaganda is that America is going to be tired of Ukraine. America is going to stop supporting Ukraine because this war cannot be too long, and Zelensky is not going to keep everyone's attention for years.
Well, there are 2 parts to that. One is, I think President Zelensky surprised a lot of people by his passion and his commitment and his courage and his genuine wartime leadership. It's a moral leadership. He's not on the battlefront, but he is there at the presidency and has been from the beginning, when many people in his position might have fled, might have, created a presidency further away from the missiles, or even a presidency in exile next door. But he did not do that. And he stayed to face the music with his country. I think that first and foremost is what attracted him to the world. Then he is obviously a very, very clever and experienced and compelling communicator. So he is, along with a team of speechwriters and including his wife, have crafted messages for his own domestic audience, i.e. his own people, and for the international community. And he's targeted each one to each place where he talks. And it's very, very clever. It's very painstaking. It's very labor intensive, and it's worked. So that's one thing. Then the question about war fatigue. I think what you've seen so far is an unprecedented show of unity by the West, which can often be disunited. It has confounded Putin, and it's also confounded, I think, the West itself, NATO itself. And it is in large part due to grassroots support in all the Western and NATO nations. People have been in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. And that's a very different and unprecedented thing, certainly in my experience. I believe Western politicians have been equally motivated by their people's support of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian cause. Now, in my opinion, if the West wants to keep this support and wants to create a victory in Ukraine, then it needs to speed up the level and the amount and the time of support, because obviously the longer it goes on, the less good it is for Ukraine. People are dying there. There's food insecurity around the world because of what Russia's doing and blaming the West, wrongly saying that there are sanctions against, grain exports. There's, hostage taking and blackmail over energy, which has affected many parts of the world. There's total destabilization. And the quicker this ends, and Putin understands that he has to come to the negotiating table, the better.
Yeah, but at the same time, as you're traveling a lot and you talk to different people in different countries, you might have noticed that there is the isolation of Russia, of Putin's regime, is not really global. Yeah, it has been isolated by the West, by the European Union, by America, but it maintains strong ties with China and Asian countries and Turkey and Latin America. And as we know, there are certain, for example, Arab countries whose oil imports
profits.
Profits, because they are buying oil products from Russia,
Yeah.
and they are selling to Europe. So in terms of profits, President Putin remains in his very solid position.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Yes, that is very true. He's been able to conduct business with China, with India, with Africa, as you mentioned, with the UAE and other Arab oil-producing states. On the one hand, all of these countries, by and large, the majority of them, voted yet again against the invasion at the UN General Assembly by the same amount that voted originally against the invasion. That's pretty good. Clearly, there were some who voted for Putin, and there were many who abstained. But I do believe that in general, the international community knows that invading a border for no reason, ignoring the United Nations mandated rule of law and international order is wrong. But as you say, for many reasons, there is, Putin's narrative is also taking root in many other parts of the world. And I think that's due to a lot of reasons. On the one hand, I think people might say, well, what is the United States and the West saying? Look at what they did in Iraq. Look at what they did in Libya, etc. But none of that, of course, excuses and forgives 20 years later this invasion in the heart of Europe for no reason. But I do believe that Russia has been perfecting a very powerful disinformation campaign. You know that the Prigozhin group, the Wagner group, has got troll farms, has inserted itself very, very strategically in many African countries. Its forces, its militia there are almost, taking the part, for instance, of French soldiers in places like Mali, Burkina Faso, the Central African Republic. But not only that, where they are also accused of pillaging the natural resources of these countries, but they are also very successfully sowing disinformation. So if you get bombarded by disinformation, and if you are sitting in any one of those countries and you hear from Russia that it's because of the US and the UN and sanctions that food poverty exists, that it's because of the West that that Ukraine provoked Russia, and Russia had all of that is total lies. I mean, but complete 100% lies. But some people believe it. And that is the challenge. That is the challenge, to get the truth and actual facts and knowledge out there. And just look at what happened at the G20 in India. Very bad for the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. It ended with no joint communique and more quarrels over the Ukraine war.
Yeah, but was it a primary sin of the Western liberal democracies that the war in Iraq was such a miserable turning point for the global attitude to the
miserable turning point, and it ended up to be based on untruths, the untruth about weapons of mass destruction and the untruth about formal links between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. Having said that, we in the West, certainly the press that followed that route, made many internal investigations and made many mea culpas and apologized for getting it wrong. Governments in the West have spoken at length about it and come close to admitting that they made, very serious mistakes. And yet none of that excuses.
Absolutely, yeah.
You can't keep saying, well, you did it, therefore we'll do it. The fact of the matter is that civilian targets are being hit over a period of 1 year relentlessly in Ukraine for nothing, for absolutely nothing. There's not even a pretext of weapons of mass destruction or links with terrorist organizations. It's just that Putin decided that he didn't want to see any democracy on his border. He wanted to create an imperialist version of the previous Soviet empire. So he'd be having his own sphere of influence, forgetting that countries around him don't actually want that. So two wrongs don't make a right.
As a long-time international reporter who was following Russian politics since '90s, and you were covering wars in Balkan Peninsula exactly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. How do you? What's your point of view on Western approach towards former Soviet Union? Was it misfortune? Was it probably one of the reasons for everything what's happening right now? Because for many Russian liberals, the West is partially to blame for not creating some kind of Marshall Plan, for not trying to bring Russia into the family of nations. At the same time, a friend of mine and the brilliant journalist Anne Applebaum claims that, on the contrary, Russia could not feel itself a normal country. It was still the illusion of Russia being a superpower was being maintained by the West, and that created the wrong perception of itself.
I mean, look, it's really complex. The fact of the matter is that the Soviet Union collapsed because of a Russian president who decided that people's freedom mattered more than keeping this artificial political tyrannical construct over so many, hundreds of millions of people in the former Soviet Union. And at the same time worked, or not, but partnered with an American president to not deliberately, but create the circumstances by which this system, collapsed. Remember that it was the Russian invasion of Afghanistan that created so much stress on the Soviet system. That was a huge, huge problem. That was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, a 10-year period of bleeding the nation that also contributed to this. And so I think that you can't just blame the West, and nor can the West claim great credit for the fall of the Soviet Union. It was something that happened between two superpowers at a particular time in history. People can go back and revisit the post-Soviet history. And of course, I was there in late 91 and early 92. One thing I remember witnessing very, very vividly, and it stays with me throughout this war now that Russia has launched in Ukraine, that it was Russia, Yeltsin, it was Ukraine, the president at the time, it was the president of Belarus at the time, who banded together and behind Gorbachev's back created independent states. Yeah. They chose that. Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus chose those three independent states in 1991, and then formed what was it called? The Confederation of Independent States. Commonwealth, exactly. States. I was there in Kazakhstan, Alma-Ata it was called, when I watched the leaders sign that into existence. And then fast forward a few years, it was Russia, it was the United States, and I think Britain that gave Ukraine a security guarantee in return for Ukraine giving up its most powerful weapons, nuclear weapons and other such things, to Russia. Russia was bound to protect Ukraine's sovereignty and its territorial integrity, and Vladimir Putin has violated that. So, and this nonsense about NATO promising that it would never expand. Not 1 inch that Putin always quotes from James Baker was an idea that was rejected by the American president, George Bush. It was never a working idea. And at the same time, Russia was brought into the World Trade Organization, was given a partnership with NATO, was made a member of the G7/G8. Russia was brought in to all these international Western-led organizations because the West thought that they would be better off working with Russia. And that was going by and large okay until Putin decided in 2007 that he made that big speech about, you know, a unipolar world and how it had to, you know, it was at the Munich Security Conference.
And it was influenced by that wave of anti-Americanism caused by Iraqi war. Definitely.
Right, exactly. And here we are all these years later, 14, 15, 16 years later, paying the price for one person's vision.
Would you like to interview him?
Yes,
one day. Is he still a person to take interviews?
Of course I want to interview him. I'm sorry he doesn't feel confident enough to sit with a Western journalist and to sit with me specifically. I've asked and I will continue to ask. I am a journalist and I believe I report facts and truth. And while I may have my own personal opinions and my opinions that are formed from the experience I have gathered, covering the Balkan Wars, for instance, the war in Bosnia was a miniature version of what's happening now. A bigger country invading a smaller country for no good reason other than territorial, grabbing territory and trying to exert influence. And I've seen this playbook. I've seen it. And I can tell you one thing. A frozen conflict, which is what happened with the Dayton Accords, is a recipe for disaster in the future and for continued instability. And I just genuinely hope that in this case, all sides can get around a table and hammer out a solution that will bring peace to your region, because it's not good for Russia and it's not good for Ukraine and it's not good for the rest of the world.